So David Caswell is here from the BBC News Labs. This started when we were both invited to speak at the Open Society, and we were talking about the future of journalism and what it's going to be like in 10 years' time. And I was very impressed by what David has shared there, which was his vision about how journalism is changing. And he has been working with this fairly new field of structured journalism for some years now, and that's what he will be talking to us a little bit about. We are online on YouTube, so people, if you are watching online, you can also ask questions. Then there will be taking the questions, and we can then ask David to reply. He's going to present a little bit for about 30 minutes, around that, and then we open for questions. We have biscuits and coffee and water later on for more informal conversation. And that's it, really. Enjoy. Thank you.
Okay. Hello, everyone. This is the subject matter of the talk, and I'm actually going to kind of reset expectations kind of right out the gate here by adding a couple of caveats here in that I really don't know what the future of production, distribution, and archiving of news is. I have a pretty well-developed idea, which I'm going to share with you here. But obviously, there's a lot of uncertainty about where media in general and news specifically is going. Just before I get into this, I'll just give you a little bit of a background in News Labs. So I'm the executive product manager for BBC News Labs. And we're about a 20-person innovation team or incubation team at the BBC focused on experimentation. So we build prototypes of new forms of news and new ways of producing news. We do some of that is focused on things like efficiency improvements or sort of modifications or small adjustments to existing processes and products. But a lot of it is focused on what we call discontinuous innovation, so sort of step function, new paradigm innovation. That's probably about half of what we do. We're a kind of a center that's in between a bunch of the big organizations at the BBC. So the editorial organization is one of our big sponsors and funders, and some of us report up into the editorial organization. And the same with R&D and engineering and product. I report up into the product organization. So it's a very kind of collaborative, kind of multidisciplinary group within the BBC. We do sprint-based projects. We have an 8-week project cycle, and so we have these very fast-paced projects where we kind of go from concept to finished prototype in about 8 weeks with a team of typically 3-4 engineers, and we have typically 3-4 projects running in any 8-week project cycle. And then our mandate is not just to kind of inform what happens in the BBC and in BBC News, but to kind of share that more widely with the news environment and the news industry. So that's News Labs. So before I get into the meat of things, I just want to sort of warn here that I'm going to be using some kind of generalizations. It's very hard to kind of get into all the little specific details on little caveats and special cases and edge cases on some of the stuff I'll talk about. So if you're kind of interested in the specifics of any little part of this, just talk to me afterwards and we can get into that. Okay, so I'm going to start here by talking about something that I'll call the topology of communication, like topology as in network topology or sort of a geographic kind of arrangement. And I'll start off with this simple kind of topology, which is communication that is basically kind of person to person. So it's the kind of communication where one person says something, the other person hears what the person says, one person writes something, the other person reads what the person writes. There's another kind of topology here, which is a one-to-many topology, which is one, it's typically not a person, it's typically an organization. One organization communicates a message, and that message goes out to a very, very large number of people, either in writing or in broadcasting. And then there's a third communication topology, which is a topology in which there are lots and lots of message senders, and they can all send messages to all the other message senders or receivers or agents in the communication system. And so, these are as you'll probably kind of recognize. Oh, and also this many-to-many communication environment is mediated by these platforms that sort of do the actual transmission and organization of messages. So you probably kind of recognize this is kind of almost a history here. It is a history where the one-to-many communication environment kind of lasted from whenever it was we developed language, I guess, to approximately the rise of the printing press, and that's obviously approximate, but sometime around then, and then we entered a new era when single organizations, initially with the printing press and then with broadcast towers and access to radio airwaves, were able to send messages to vast numbers of people, including with print across space and time. You didn't actually have to be present, and so on. And then we had that era for a long period of time, and then from the 60s to the 90s, depending on what you think the internet is, we had this transition, and we're now sort of firmly in this many-to-many communication environment where everybody has a broadcast studio and tower in their pocket and a printing press in their pocket that has global reach. And so it's just, for me anyways, helpful to kind of start off with sort of this sort of broad view of sort of the first principles of the communication environment that we're in. And so there's some interesting characteristics of these. So one interesting thing is the difference between the real-time aspect of communication and communicating across space and time. And so this developed obviously a little differently between the one-to-many communication environment, where we started off with real-time communication, just speech. And then a little later on, about 5,000 years ago or so, we developed communication across space and time, which would be writing. And that's the reverse of the way it happened with the one-to-many environment, where we started off with communicating across space and time with printing, and then only later did we figure out how to do real-time communication. But in the many-to-many communication environment, both of these functions are kind of simultaneously served by the internet. And then another interesting characteristic of these different communication topologies is in artifacts, the artifacts that they generate. And so basically in the one-to-one communication environment, there just aren't a lot of artifacts. There's only so many books that you can write by hand and documents that you can write by hand and so on. When we move into the one-to-many environment, broadcasting really never left artifacts. I mean, it kind of did, and when VHS tapes came along, I guess a little bit more so, but not really sort of to any great degree. You don't get a lot of radio programs and television programs in that era that have this sort of persistent state. But lots and lots of printed artifacts, and those would obviously increase with the number of publishers, of printers, and so on, but it was a kind of a linear thing. And then we get into the many-to-many communication environment, and everything sort of just breaks free, basically. We have these digital documents and bits of audio and bits of video, and in that environment, the accumulation of these artifacts is exponential. So just some quick characteristics of the many-to-many communication environment. So one interesting thing is that this is kind of the end-state communication topology. If you were to come back here in 500,000 years, whatever we were at that point, we would be communicating probably in a many-to-many communication environment. If you were to get in touch with an alien civilization around Alpha Centauri or something that was billions of years ahead of us, they would probably be communicating in a many-to-many communication topology. It's an end state for communication. Just to state the obvious here, and this is very obvious to us at the BBC, in the many-to-many communication environment, there are no privileged communicators. There's no printer with a printing press or a broadcaster with a broadcast tower. Everybody can communicate to everybody else. And another interesting thing about it is when you look at it from the point of view of the individual receiver, is that there's one of the aspects of communication is the trust that you place in the communicator. And you have more trust decisions, or many, many more trust decisions in the many-to-many communication environment than you did in the one-to-many communication environment. And there's a number called Dunbar's number, which is this sort of, people disagree about what it is, like 120 to 240, there's a range. But it's this number that's supposed to be the number of meaningful relationships that a human being can have. And it's presumably a biological or neurobiological kind of feature, and it sort of comes out of our deep evolutionary past. And once you get past that number, the depth of the relationship changes. And right now, with our media relationships, the number of communicators obviously far exceeds that Dunbar number. And then this phenomena, this exponential aspect, where the number of available messages increases with the square of the number of communicators. So, what's a good way to kind of look at this, like to start to think about, how to operate or how things operate in the many-to-many communication environment. So one way, and I think a very useful way, is through the lens of economics, and not economics, monetary economics, but the economics of attention. So human attention is this sort of scarce resource in this environment, and we've got this sort of supply and demand relationship between this very, very scarce attention that we all have, and I'm sure we're all pretty familiar with that, and this super abundant information environment that we're all sort of inhabiting. And this is actually a pretty good paper, because this one has a literature review of the surprisingly scarce literature on this, and also a very simple to understand little model of attention economics. But when you go through this stuff, it kind of ends up looking something like this, in that attention is a linear phenomena. It's basically flatlined, because there are no little spaces in our lives that we cannot consume media in. So we've kind of maxed out on the attention that we can give to these communication artifacts. So that's basically a constant at this point, or at least a linear phenomena. But because we're in this many-to-many communication environment, and because the number of communications grows with the square of the number of communicators, the information environment is exponential. And so we have this phenomena where the difference between the two, the difference between what we can consume and what there is available to consume, is also exponential. And so what this sets up is this zero-sum, unwinnable competition for attention. And both of those words, zero-sum and unwinnable, are very deliberate. It really is a zero-sum competition, because you can't get somebody's attention unless they give up attention to something else, because we're basically maxed out in the attention we can put on media. And it's unwinnable because it's exponential. You've got linear attention and exponential information. So you can't, the pie is always shrinking. And that shrinking pie is a really interesting way to look at this, specifically in terms of a metric that originated in the advertising world called share of voice. And it's basically, of all the people who are shouting about beer or cars or whatever the thing they're advertising, what portion of all that advertising is your company's advertising. That's what share of voice means in the advertising world. But you can use this metric as a sort of a proxy for news organizations, or news as a mode of communication, in that the share of voice of a news organization or news within the communication environment inexorably gets smaller and smaller and smaller over time as that sort of exponential phenomena starts to occur. And so some of the consequences, I think we're all probably pretty familiar with the sort of the trauma and the disruption that has kind of gone through the news world. But one of them is that there's this, because of the decreasing share of voice, there's decreased relevance for individual news producers. And this varies. I mean, there's a lot of legacy claims that some news producers have on consumers for legacy reasons. So the BBC has an immense brand and an immense infrastructure for generating news. The New York Times has, and so on. But these are brands and resources that were developed in the one-to-many communication environment that have carried over. They're not sort of native to the many-to-many communication environment. So over time, they atrophy. Another phenomena is this increase in trust decisions by each news consumer, and so there's a corresponding decrease in trust in any one individual communicator. And then a third one is the sense-making burden that's placed on news consumers. So it used to be, for better or for worse, you would get told the way it was from one television station or one newspaper. But now you basically have this sort of huge pool of documents and that you have to sort of go through and make your own decisions. And that's very good, because you can make your own decisions, but it's also cognitively difficult to do, because you have to make your own decisions. So these are all very challenging for news organizations, and so the question becomes, where does this go? Like, what's the, how can we even address this, because at one level it's a maths problem, right? I mean, it's if that's just the nature of the many-to-many communication environment that we're in, what can you do against maths? Well, there's been some attempts at different sort of paradigms for news. This is the structure of scientific revolutions. The paradigm, you kind of move the center from the Earth to the sun, and then all the calculations become much simpler. So what are the possible kind of new paradigms that you could bring to news to kind of unravel this knot, or this sort of set of problems that are coming from the many-to-many communication environment? Well, there's been a few of them. So initially it was like, well, let's just organize this stuff in directories. So that was Yahoo in the 90s. I used to work at Yahoo. Then it was like, well, it's kind of too many documents to organize in a directory. Let's just search through them all. So you can put in your keywords, and it'll go and kind of find the best documents. Then that was kind of a bit of a pain, because it's still useful for a lot of things, but for day-to-day news and all the rest of it, it wasn't something. It's a pull phenomena rather than a push phenomena, to use the media terms. So the next thing that sort of popped up, and this is 2008, 2009 kind of era, is personalized news feeds. So you're going to have the endless scroll. It's going to be on your phone, and it'll be ranked in order of relevance, whatever criteria that's figured out by. And this is Facebook or apps like in those days it was Zeit and Prismatic, and those are some of the pioneers for that. Facebook, Yahoo News. I was involved in the personalization project at Yahoo News. And that has not really worked out for various reasons either. There's a very kind of early glimmer of a new kind of paradigm in this world to find documents in a more intelligent and more directed way. So it's a form of search that lets you do things like narrow in time and by geography and by named entities and by topics and other criteria, so that you can search but in more sophisticated ways than you can with just a keyword search. But those are typically used by governments and police forces and analysts and business analysts and this kind of thing. But all of those four what they're basically doing is helping you to navigate this sort of big tsunami of documents that the many-to-many communication environment has thrown up. But what I'm going to talk about here is a different paradigm, which is this fifth one here, which is modular content. And the difference between those four and modular content is that modular content kind of changes what the unit is, or what the artifact is. So this paradigm, this modular content paradigm, it's about changing the artifacts of news. And so the sort of a hypothesis here is that the problem is in the artifacts, and that we're using artifacts that are native to the one-to-many communication environment that came up or became useful with printing presses and broadcast environments. So these are text articles and little bits of audio and little bits of video programs and so on. We're using these artifacts in this new many-to-many communication environment, and that's where the problem lies. And specifically, it's there because these become commodities in this environment, because everybody has a broadcast studio in their pocket, everybody has a printing press in their pocket. And the corollary of this is what we need to do is we need to find new artifacts that can create new value that's specific to the many-to-many communication environment. So in other words, they can do things that the old artifacts cannot do, and then retain that value to the producer, so that a news organization can create new value with new artifacts and then keep that value to pay basically the salaries of the journalists. And so finding those new artifacts, what are those new artifacts of news, that's a question. And so, to use a metaphor here of Lego, the idea here is that you deconstruct news. You don't just have an article, you have a bunch of semantic information in that article, or editorial or semantic information in that article, and you can break that apart into the little pieces that are labeled with metadata, and work with those artifacts, and then rebuild them as you need for different people in different circumstance. And it requires, to take the metaphor a little further here, it requires that you have the little pieces, and also that you have the metadata system or the description that you can label these. And that's not just named entities or topics, that's kind of rich editorial metadata. So this is not a new thing. This may look a lot similar to this. This idea of the semantic web, and sort of the semantic web, it gets a lot of eye rolling now, where it's a little kind of hasn't worked out so well in some ways, But in other ways, it's actually maybe ahead of its time in that there's more and more of these systems that have smaller units of some kind labeled with metadata of richer and richer kind that are maybe the semantic web in a different form than it was originally imagined. So some specific examples. So these are from News Labs. So here's an example with little bits of text. So the one on the left there is one that our visual journalism team has done. And this is very simple. This is you have an article, and you have the Guardian also does this. You've probably seen this in other places as well. Terms that require explanation, or that frequently require explanation, are little links and little expanders, and you can hit the little expander, and it will expand and will give you the little explanation for the thing that's expanded. Very simple. The one on the right just has different versions. This is a question and answer format, and it has different versions of each answer. So you can have a long version, or a short version, or a video. And so these are experiments, but they're live on our web pages. And what they're doing here is they're a little more than an article. They've broken down the big block of text into little editorially useful things, and labeled and used those little editorially useful things. Here's another project that we've done over the last few months, and this is a project using natural language generation, or template-based natural language generation. So this is taking, in this specific case, taking data that's reported by a system called Alexis that reports immediately the results of elections when they're declared. It's sort of a news gathering system. And so it's an API that reports the results of elections. And this takes the data from that API and instantly writes an article, which is the one on the right there, that reports the election results. And so this is from the local elections a month or 6 weeks ago. The one on the left is the typical thing that journalists would do. They would typically cut and paste. So this is showing up on the local topic pages on the BBC website. So you put in your postal code and you get this sort of local news, and this is where this is showing up. And typically the local journalist would monitor the BBC election Twitter feed and then cut and paste the tweet into the local topic page and put a little bit of text. Whereas we can instantaneously, with this tool, write a full article. And this is modular because it's the data in the API, that's the modularity that we're working with, that's generating the text of the article. Here's one that's in progress. This is kind of fun. So this is a project, and we don't know if this is feasible yet. We're still in the feasibility assessment stage with this. But what we think we can do is, we think we can take a very specific kind of formulaic story, stories in health, in the health domain, that are based on studies. So if you kind of go through the health website on the BBC, you'll see a fair number of these stories, which is, it starts off with somebody has done a study or a report or a survey or something, and it has these implications, and here's some detail from it, and these are the implications, and here's an example, and here's another example, and here's a reaction to the study, and maybe here's another reaction and an analysis and a conclusion. And so these are very formulaic. There's a relatively small number of little blocks of text that we can label editorially as with their editorial function, and understand the article at that level, not within the blocks of text, but at the blocks of text level. And then what we think we can do is use that to generate comics or graphical stories or graphical versions of those stories. It's still in the early days. It's an ambitious project. But working with that sort of decomposition or that modularity of those kinds of articles, that's something that we think is feasible. Happening in audio as well. Google, the slide on the left, the image on the left there is from Google. Google now requests from audio publishers that they break up their audio or annotate their audio so that if you have one of these, if you have a Alexa or Siri or Google Home and you ask it for a flash briefing and you get sort of the little news briefing, well, what they want you to do is to annotate that so they can break it up. So they can give you a little flash briefing, but the first story is from the BBC, the second story is from somebody else, and so on. And that's an example of modularity that Google's trying to get publishers to adopt so that they can use computationally to assemble customized news broadcasts. We're doing similar things at the BBC. We have We have tools to break up programs like the Today program and other programs and chapterization of things. So this is something that we're trying to do a lot of work with ourselves internally. And then where that carries on to is things like voice and chatbots, where you basically have dialogue trees or sort of kind of mappings of how content kind of relates to each other, perhaps connected with or selected through machine learning. This is usually for intent mapping, where you're trying to take a natural language question and map it to a specific point in a dialogue tree. And then you can kind of do the same thing with chat and voice, very similar. We have a range of projects. The BBC is actually investing quite a lot in voice and AI-driven kind of voice interfaces. And then you can combine all these together. This is a project we did last summer called News Mixer. And what this is it's the same story, but what we've done is we've mapped the specific story points or the structure within the story to tell the same story in audio, in text, and in video. And so you can switch back and forth between the stories and be at exactly the same point in each format. And originally this was sort of like, this is something that people could use to sort of choose their format, but it turns out that it's a really, really interesting way to tell stories and that people can get more out of the story by consuming it in ways that they prefer. So these are all examples of labs, of news labs projects that involve modularity of content at some level. And so these modules, these little bits of text, I mean, they exist on a continuum, and the continuum is between language on one end at the left here and just pure data on the other side. So with the pure data, that project, the natural language generation project, starts with pure data basically, whereas there are products and projects that we do where it's just a full article that's got some annotation on it, where the article can be, it's tagged in a certain way and can therefore be used for certain things. For example, we tag articles by the intended use of the article or the expected use of the article, so you can use that in the distribution. So there's a lot of things you can do with this and kind of go with this once you have content kind of broken down into little bits. One thing you can do is you can change the content item itself for the individual. You can personalize it for the individual. So you can take a say a brand, say BBC News, for example, which is a single brand with a single website and a single app. And you can take a diverse population, say the population of the UK, with lots and lots of different segments, audience segments, all the way down to the individual, theoretically. And if you make the artifact of news not the finished product, not the one-size-fits-all article, but you make the artifact some kind of story model, which is what we do with the natural language generation project, then you can create variants of the content for each specific audience segment. So you've been able to customize the presentation of the content, and you can do that by language, you can do it by writing style, you can do it by the degree of graphics, in how visual is it, lots of different dimensions. But once you have the content accessible at that modular level, then you get to do all this. And so there's a range of architectures that can fit this. So we talked about the one on the left. The one in the middle there is an architecture that's basically about variability of background knowledge in a piece of content. So you might have different background knowledge for different audience members. For example, young audience members may not have lived through the news of the sort of the deep background of certain news stories. So if you're 21, you might not have a rich background of, say, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, for example. But if you're 55, you might have a very rich background of that. So providing more background for younger audience members might make sense. Another one is using these little modules to arrange a dialogue tree for voice or for chat. So these would be the same modules, just sort of used for a different purpose. So that's and these these can work within existing workflows. These are the diagrams here kind of pertain to components of articles or bits of articles that are already sort of being generated by existing workflows. You could do entirely new workflows, right? So this is a different approach where instead of going into the written text, for example, in this case on the left there, and trying to extract stuff from the written text, the possibility of authoring news directly into story models is also a possibility, and there are examples of this in academia and elsewhere, and a few other cases where that's been tried. And the idea there is that you create the story model, or the sort of the structured version of the story, and then that is used to build all of these tools, these rich tools that are distributed to users. And this is the kind of thing that random people on the internet can't do all the stuff on the right there. This is moving the journalism out of this sort of commodity many-to-many environment and moving it back into a world where you need a newsroom to do this, because all of this stuff kind of works together and is not you can't do it by just pushing a button on your phone. This is happening. This kind of modular content is happening in production in different parts of the BBC. For example, we have a new content management system that is just starting to roll out called Optimo. And it's based on essentially recursive blocks, or a hierarchy of blocks, each block being essentially a module. And it has this concept of metadata at the block level, and it has a concept of variants of blocks. And so that's essentially a post-article CMS that can support this. And this is not a research project. This is the production CMS, or the new production CMS. We have a production project, and again, production, not R&D, in the audio side. It's called Internet Fit Radio. I think it should be called Internet Fit Audio, but there it is. But it's basically about breaking apart digital audio into all of its component pieces that can be kind of reassembled and used for kind of new purposes. We have a production, again, not an experiment, but a production API to distribute modules for audio and video. And then in our R&D department, we've got multiple projects going on. We've got a large flagship project called Object-Based Media. There's some good demos on this of this online that enables the assembly of very, very rich, complex experiences from modular media. A project called IP Studio to sort of do the same for video that Internet Fit Radio is doing for audio, roughly. There's a whole bunch of experimentation around structured journalism, atomized news. There was a project called New News last year that tried out about 30 different kinds of modular forms. And then there's the voice team, the voice and AI team, which is a big team. So the point here is that this isn't just sort of a little niche R&D thing. All of this stuff is new. Like, all of these are kind of new things that are still they still have to prove their worth and find their place in the BBC and how we use them. But it's not a fringe thing. It's a mainstream thing. And this stuff is happening beyond the BBC and indeed beyond journalism. And so essentially, this sort of core problem, the many-to-many communication environment with this tsunami of documents and the problems of how to deal with that tsunami of documents, the trust in the documents, the trust in the sources, the sense-making problem, and so on. It's happening in every information-centric domain. It's happening on the left there in scientific publishing. It's a kind of a cliche in the science world now that you can either keep up with the literature or you can do original work, but you can't do both. And even that's probably generous. One of the reactions to that has been a modular initiative called nano publications that seeks, especially in the biosciences and pharmaceuticals, to publish at what they call the smallest unit of publication, and then build products that use those small units of publication to understand the field. Law, there's a budding field of computable law where they basically turn law itself into essentially a code that you can sort of run encoded contracts against and have self-executing contracts and entirely computable forms of law. And there's books about that. I mean, it's a thing. On the bottom left there, you've got a field in technical publishing called structured authoring. And so this is a field that is used by organizations that build and maintain very, very complex systems. So, for example, Airbus or IBM or companies that are doing big complex things that have thousands and thousands of manuals. Structured authoring enables the authoring of the support and information about those systems in little pieces, and then there's a mapping function that enables the use of them and the presentation of them in different ways in different applications. So you could have somebody on an iPad, sort of fixing the wiring in an A380, and they see the maintenance iPad version. And you could have somebody else using exactly the same content to make like a regulatory application or something. And so that's there are tools for this, and there's a standard for this. This is not a fringe thing. The intelligence world, so GCHQ and DARPA and the CIA and the NSA, they're all over this because they're suffering from this same set of problems. This is a diagram from a project that DARPA is running right now called ADA. And basically they want to go out into the media world, break apart video and text at huge scale, turn them into little pieces, hold all those pieces in what they call a semantic repository, and then reassemble those little pieces into hypotheses and storylines and all the rest of it, which should sound pretty familiar to you guys. And the same thing is happening in enterprise knowledge management. And then I mentioned the Optimos CMS that we have, the BBC, the publishing system, and the Washington Post, inspired by Jeff Bezos. They have a similar system called ARC, and that again is a CMS that allows publishing in little pieces and sort of working at those little piece levels. So this seems to be sort of a thing that's kind of coming out of the zeitgeist all over the place, not just at the BBC. So where's it all going? This is kind of, I guess, the big question, right? And so you've probably all seen this quote here that we tend to get all excited about technologies in the short run, and then it sort of falls flat. But in the long run, we kind of tend to underestimate how impactful these things will be. And so what I'm going to do here is just sort of maybe speculate a little bit about what the long run for a modular view of content might look like. So if this continues and all this experimentation kind of bears fruit, and this becomes a significant part of our news environment, what implications might that have a little further down the road? And so a starting point is to sort of maybe speculate about a possible second wave of disruption in news. And so the first kind of wave of disruption or revolution in news, and we're kind of well into that, or maybe nearing the end of that even, is this disruption where the artifacts remain familiar, bits of audio, bits of video, bits of text. How different is a podcast from a radio program, for example. So we're familiar with the artifacts, but what's been disrupted is the distribution of the artifacts. So a distinction of between a podcast and a radio program is that any random person can do a podcast. To do a radio program, you need a big tower and a piece of radio spectrum to broadcast it on. And so that disruption has happened through, obviously, social and search and all the rest of it. We use artificial intelligence, say, or tools or machine learning tools for a whole range of things here. We use it for search, we use it for personalized ranking, and we use it, at least in the BBC, for different ways to facilitate the processes of building these programs and articles. But the disruption is mostly in the distribution of the artifacts. And sort of the speculation here is that maybe there's a second revolution or disruption, wave of disruption on the way. And it's about the artifacts themselves. So it's maybe we're going to be leaving the articles and radio programs and TV programs behind at some point and moving to new artifacts. For example, an oracle. So Alexa, tell me what happened in the last 3 indicative votes for Brexit, and who voted for for in all 3 votes. Some very, very specific questions where you can have a true dialogue with a knowledgeable voice or chat interface. That's a ways away. That's a very kind of far away thing. But how far away? 5 years, 15 years? There's some pretty exciting things happening with the Alexa Prize, for example, if you follow that. We've talked a lot about personalization, personal journalists, or news sites that essentially act as personal journalists, so that you have customized news about very specific things that very specifically pertain to you, delivered in a particular way that is particularly suited to the way you want to consume that news. The background, the language, how terse it is, how colloquial it is, all the rest of it. Or network news, all of these little pieces with their metadata, they all connect to each other. And when you start to connect these little pieces together, there's a lot of ways where that lets you do things that are new and different. And in this environment, the disruption is probably in the extremity of the personalization. It's very hard to see what archiving actually means when everybody's experience might be quite different. And in this case, the machine learning tools and the so-called AI, that's what's doing the assembly of the personalization of the content and the delivery of that content. That maybe content's the wrong word. Maybe experience is the right word. So maybe that'll happen. To dig in on the network news, these little pieces, if you take the sort of the old model on the left there and you break all the little pieces, the editorial pieces or semantic pieces apart, you can assemble these in new structures. Call them storylines, for example, or narrative networks, or event-centric knowledge graphs. There was a project, the Newsreader project, which was a Horizon 2020 project that finished in 2016, I think it was, that basically kind of broke apart large corpuses of text from the finance and the automotive domain, and then reassembled those into storylines, and then enabled interaction with those storylines, and had tools to visualize those storylines. And that was centered on what they called an event-centric knowledge graph, with events and narrative structures being at the core of that. And so these are the kind of things you can do when you connect all of these little pieces up together. And if that were to happen at scale, if event-centric knowledge graphs were to become kind of the center of news organizations, what might that do, right? So one thing that it lets you do, obviously, is it makes the news directly accessible to computation. So you don't have to do things like OCR and try to do natural language understanding on text. You've actually got the labeling because it's been created as structured data. The personalization we talked about, right now the way stories are told essentially and presented is a producer choice. It's a publisher choice. It's a broadcaster choice. What happens when that becomes a consumer choice? Separates reporting from writing, and this has got an interesting characteristic in that, one of the phenomena, one of the sort of the characteristics of traditional journalism that's kind of taken for granted is how tied it is to individual authorship. So it's a journalist or a very small group of journalists who actually produce the finished article. Whereas if you can separate the reporting from the writing, in other words, the reporting puts the little pieces into the database, and the machine or something else takes care of the writing. If you do that, then you can make the assembly of the journalism collective rather than individual. So you don't just have one person working on one story. You have the community, whether it's the community of the newsroom or the broader community, working on stories. So that becomes possible. And I think maybe one of the most maybe speculative, but also potentially impactful outcomes of this view of news is that it enables news to become a permanent cumulative thing. So it's not like the situation now where you write an article, it goes on the website, people read it for a few days, and then it goes away. It goes into an archive, but no one ever looks in the archive. It's useless in the archive. Or the program gets made, it gets shown on television, it's maybe up on iPlayer for a month, and then it kind of goes away, or it goes into some big database that is essentially inaccessible. In this scenario, the news, as it accumulates in a database, as these module bits accumulate, it's still useful. It all connects to each other. You can ask it questions. You can explore it. You can do things with it because it's all connected up. And old pieces or old modules are just as accessible as brand new modules. And if you were to have that, right? First of all, it would remove the distinction between news and archive. But if you were to have that, the possibility of collective refinement comes in. So this is like code, right? So one of the phenomena associated with software is, software is a collective, the big complex software systems are collective endeavors because, code is modular, it's got its own specifics, everybody can write on it. Many, many teams can contribute to the same artifact of software, which allows these very, very large, sophisticated artifacts to be created. And so if you're building news loosely in a form of code, maybe you can do that with news. And that's a pretty powerful thing, because that implies that you can you can continually improve, you can continually explore. And you look at some of the other phenomena that exhibit that characteristic. Code is one, DNA is another one. Science is kind of like that. You're kind of getting into a world where news becomes more like science over kind of long periods of time. And what that might do to our historical knowledge and our access to historical knowledge and our ability to use historical knowledge as context for our sort of day-to-day news, who knows what that could be. So I'm going to stop there. That's sort of the end of my speculation, and I'm going to just open it up for questions.
Thank you so much, David. This is really fascinating. I'm sure there's many insights that it's given us speaking with my Living with Machines head here. I just wanted to start with a couple of questions. I think it's kind of broad, that makes sense for us, but then I will open up for more comments. So I think this is relevant to us in two ways. First, because we are analyzing mining newspapers collections. So I was wondering whether you ever tried, and what would be the challenges of kind of back structuring historical archives that were not built in this particular way.
Yep.
How useful would that be to kind of make sense of articles? What are the structure of these news artifacts that we can find in 19th century journalism? Yep. But also in terms of putting together, you gave us an outline of how this structure of information is pollinating other fields. How long do you think this is going to become more mainstream? We are a 5-year project. In terms of our outputs, our interfaces, and how we present the content, the findings of these collections that can be mined automatically. In 5 years' time, how mainstream will that be? Do we have to be prepared for that, and how much? Do you have some? Can you give us some comments on that?
Well, I'll answer the first one first. So extracting structure out of like a large corpus of existing text, and that's probably one of the most common ways that people interact with structure, or organizations interact with structure in a large corpus. The newsreader project that I mentioned was specifically focused on that. I mean, their corpus was text on the web. The challenge then is what is the structure you can extract, obviously, and it's very easy to do sort of named entity extraction and topic modeling and sort of those kind of technical structures. It's a little challenging to do things like event extraction, and it's even more challenging to do event extraction and to connect those events to each other in different ways, which was the focus of the newsreader project. So there are ways that the newsreader and a lot of what I've just described they're essentially deterministic ways of looking at structure. So they, if you have a journalist who can assemble these things or put metadata on these things and tag these things, that's relatively easy because you have sort of a human to make the decisions. But there are probabilistic ways as well. There's been a couple of small projects that use topic modeling, LDA topic modeling, in a creative way, where you basically kind of do the topic modeling by very narrow time periods, and then connect the topics together to understand the storylines as topics sort of appear and then sort of have a lifetime and then die out. So those are probabilistic ways of at least getting to a coarse idea of storyline. And I think for how long all this stuff plays out, I mean, there's an awful lot of experimentation going on, and there's always the chance that some product or some technology sort of moves us rapidly forward quickly. But I don't know. I kind of get the sense that it's going to be a kind of a slow improvement here, optimization there, experimentation on user interfaces here, and it's hard to say. I do think this is like decades and decades There's going to be, there's products now that are based on this, but in terms of sort of having an ecosystem based on this and having sort of a rich and sort of mastery of the basic representations for news and how they're used and what the products are, I think that's probably decades, but you never know.
Thank you very much. That was really interesting. Actually, I have a question about the ethics of news personalization.
Yep.
So, something that we sort of hear a lot is that sort of hyper personalization is the cause of filter bubbles and polarization in the media and all this kind of thing.
Yep.
And I'm wondering if these are conversations that happen at the BBC,
yep,
and whether there's sort of policy within the institution, especially sort of given that the BBC has this kind of special remit as
yep,
to be sort of collective and national and objective and all these things.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, and that's a huge thing at the BBC. So there's an initiative at the BBC that's referred to as the public service algorithm, and it's not an algorithm. It's a sort of a set of approaches to this. And that's a very significant project that touches a lot of this. And there's a deeper kind of point, I think, there in that, if news sort of becomes these sort of networks, the sort of network news, one of the phenomena of networks is there is a sort of a winner-take-all kind of phenomena, network effects, and sort of this is why Facebook is who they are. I saw a graph the other day. I think it might be in the Reuters Institute report. Maybe I'm wrong, but it's basically about how much each of the platforms is used versus how much people hate it. And Facebook is like everybody uses it and everybody hates it. It's a really kind of weird place to be for a product company. And so what I would sort of put out there is if this form of content is sort of in the zeitgeist, if it's an inevitability, then it would be very good if that network was not owned by a big tech company on the West Coast. It'd be good for a public service organization to be the custodian of that, because it would be a custodian arrangement. So.
Thanks for that. I was just wondering, you said you're getting a new CMS. Is that something that exists in the world already, or are you building it in-house?
Building it in-house, yeah. Yeah, the rough equivalent to our in-house CMS that is licensable in the world is the ARC CMS that the Washington Post has built, and it's also a modular CMS that enables news to be sort of assembled in units smaller than the article. There's one other that I'm aware of, which is not publicly licensable. It's the Oak CMS at the New York Times. I think that's a little less developed. So.
Hi, thanks. That was a really interesting talk.
Thank you.
So what I'm thinking about is the integrity of the record and how this kind of changes what's being produced for different people. Do you talk much to your archivists about what you're doing to get their perspective on how you might subsequently have to maintain and preserve these artifacts?
Not really. At this stage, for us in News Labs, at least, there may be other conversations going on with some of these other projects that I'm not aware of. But in News Labs, we're an experimental team. Like we do experiments, we do prototypes. If one of our prototypes is deemed to be successful enough to go on to production, and we have multiple prototypes that do that, then there's a negotiation with a real engineering team that do the very, very careful systematic work of not just the putting it into production technically, but having all of the systems and policies and everything that go around it. So that's something that at this point would probably not be useful for us to have that conversation unless we basically had a kind of a form that we were going to put in production more broadly.
I had a question about the size of the kind of components. So have you experimented on, like, if something's modular and tailorable, I guess that can happen at different scales. So have you experimented with different sizes of building blocks?
Yeah.
And at what level of granularity does it stop reading like a story in the way that people are used to encountering it? What stage does it feel like it's produced by a machine rather than?
It doesn't, right? So, the building blocks are basically a continuum. So you could look at a building block. You could look at an article itself being a building block with metadata tagging that article, and you could go all the way through the continuum of balancing, smaller and smaller bits of, say, text with richer and richer metadata to the point where all you have is data. And so that natural language generation project that I mentioned, that is based purely on data. That's coming from a story model that is just a table in a database. And for example, that table might have a list of 325 rows, one for each local council district in the UK. And it might have, 50 fields, 40 fields or something that represent pieces of information that the journalist have determined are part of or useful story elements for stories about each of those, say, election results in those council districts. And that's just data. That's literally just a database. And then that data goes through this natural language generation template, which is authored by a journalist, and it basically is, it takes a lot of work to put these things together, but they're basically this arrangement of logic and text that determines how the story is assembled or composed depending on what the specific row is, and then that's what writes the article. And the article is indistinguishable from a human-written article. And in fact, there are a lot of studies in this, not in the BBC, but elsewhere more broadly, comparing these natural language generation articles with fully human-written articles, and there's just no difference. Like, they are literally indistinguishable and there's, I think, 5 major studies on this. And that shouldn't be surprising in hindsight, because the template is also written by a journalist. It's not like a machine learning algorithm is writing the article. It's that a journalist is using a very different kind of writing to write an article. Essentially, they're writing for the pattern of stories, not for the specific story. So it really is, although it's a machine that's churning these things out when the data is updated, it's still a journalist, a human journalist that's done the writing. They've just used a very, very unusual tool to do it. Yeah.
Hi, David.
Okay.
Thanks for a great presentation.
Thank you.
I have a question. I'm a little bit intrigued about your comparison with code. So if we think of an open source project, for instance, where you have somebody who starts a project because they want to achieve something, and then there are lots of people who contribute to that initial code, and gradually this code develops and becomes, to a certain extent, the product that the initial person who initiated the project wanted, with some changes. But there is still a sense of, I suppose, ownership and a sense of somebody who wants to drive something in a certain direction. Now, if we make this comparison with what may happen in this modularized content, is how far the comparison may go. Do you see that there is still a sort of an ownership of the person who initiate the story in a way, even if there are people who contribute to it? Or we can think at some point of a sort of a distribution, not only of participation, but also of the message, if you want, that is conveyed. And to what extent somebody like the BBC or whoever initiated these projects may want to retain ownership with all the potential, responsibility attached to it.
Yep. It's very hard to say. I think there's lots of ways that it could play out. One model would be a sort of very tight newsroom control of just as we have now. I mean, it's easy to forget how tightly controlled existing journalistic output is in news organizations. But just transferring that level of editorial control directly over into a modular world, that's an outcome. That could be a way that it works. On the other end of the spectrum, if you were able to come up with representations for, say, news events and news storylines at a level that you could say, quote unquote, open source news, with say a news organization being more of a moderator or facilitator kind of a role. all kinds of things could happen in that environment. I mean, it could be, there would probably be like Wikipedia, for example, a very, very comprehensive set of editorial guidelines that controlled, what could and what couldn't happen, and sort of the escalation chain and dispute resolution and all this kind of thing. So there are sort of models for how to manage that. But I think being aware of it, I think there's such a range of challenges, even regardless of where on that spectrum you are. An example is if you're dealing with data, you're dealing with limitations in what can be represented as data and what can't, right? So you've already got a bias towards stuff that can be represented, that you have metadata for example. There's a whole nest of new things to work through in this kind of environment. And right now, nobody, including us, is really kind of thinking, I mean, we're kind of speculating about that over pints in the pub kind of thing. But I think this is stuff that if this takes and if society moves its information and sort of knowledge management and communications into a more structured and more modular form, there's going to have to be very, very large societal debates about how this stuff is managed and connects and all. There's some very positive potential things that come out of it as well. One of them is that in this kind of environment, it's probably harder to insert falsehoods in that, if you have your news modularized and systematic in the way that these modular or structured journalism systems could enable, then when you insert a falsehood or sort of something that doesn't match, the incongruity of it is immediately or much more easily observable than it is in text. So if, for example, a politician has voted in a certain way on a certain subject for 30 years and then suddenly votes a different way, that's a lot more visible in a system where all that stuff is modularized and structured than it is where you kind of depend on a journalist having followed that politician's history in order to recognize that event has occurred. So it's possible there could be entirely new forms of integrity that come out of that. But really, who knows? It will be interesting to see what happens.
I guess from this point of view, the distinction between human and machine authorship is again at stake, isn't it?
Yeah, I don't see any of this being genuinely authored by machines. It's like what we're just talking about, is that even with these natural language generation tools, it's the way I interpret it is it's a journalist using a very different kind of writing to produce a new kind of content. But it's still completely controlled by the journalist. They write the template, they determine what happens. This is nowhere in what I've talked about here am I referring to things like the kind of natural language generation that, say, OpenAI is working with. So OpenAI, they have this, I can't remember what the model is, but it's a generative natural language generation where you give it a starting sentence and it predicts the next sentence and then the next sentence and then the next sentence. So it comes up with text basically from scratch using machine learning. And it's that's not what this is. This is fully deterministic, editorially controlled, and so on. One thing that the BBC has done along those lines, but more as a creative project than it wasn't a journalistic project, is that BBC 4 documentary called, I can't remember the name of the thing. I can't remember what it was called. It was an AI-generated documentary. This was last September, I think it was. And basically what they did was they trained some machine learning tools on the general pattern of a BBC 4 documentary. And then they sort of set it loose on the archives to come up with a sort of a prototypical BBC 4 documentary. And it is quite watchable. It's not a documentary in any sort of normal sense of the word, but it's interesting enough to watch. But that's not what I'm talking about here. What I'm talking about here is deterministic.
I have maybe you already answered this, but is it what you're saying that the template is enough to lock the system for fake news or slightly biased news, in the sense that when it's assembled, If anyone who has experience editing a text, you take a line away, it changes the meaning. And if you invert and you need to kind of correct again and again just because you change a slight thing. So if a machine is assembling these informations, is the template the thing that guarantees that it's not going to assemble in a way that conveys false information or biased information?
Exactly, and the template is written by a journalist. So, you know, it may not be as apparent as it is with the journalist's name as a byline on the document, but it's still an output of a journalist. The journalist can and it's not just deliberate misrepresentation, it's error. There's going to be a lot of error in the early days of this, but it's not really any different than writing articles case by case by case from text. You're just writing them at a level of abstraction that's higher than the specific article. You're writing for the pattern of articles, but you're still editorially in control. So yes, somebody could get a natural language generation toolkit, and they could mass produce text that misrepresented something. Of course they could do that. It's just another form of writing. There's nothing special about this in terms of that. I mean, I don't see that happening. Who knows? I mean, it might, but it's not inherent to the tool or the approach. It's just because both of these things are human generated, so humans can use them in whatever way they want. You know, just like our existing journalism.
That's great. Thank you so much, David. I will draw this to a close, but please stay with us for a little bit more. We have cake, coffee, and tea, and please let's have more informal conversations. Rather, I'm sure there's much more to fish out of this. Thank you so much. Thanks so much for coming on behalf of the Turing and the British Library. Thank you so much.
Thank you.